Okay. You got any guns or anything on you?
No, sir.
Okay, hop out. You have any weapons on you, partner?
Sir, they just
Spin around.
picked me up. Nah, look.
The tag's expired. I need to talk to you for a second. Can you just hang up the phone so I can talk to you?
I gotta call you right back.
Open your mouth for me. Open your mouth for me. Open your mouth for me.
Some losses leave behind more than grief. They leave behind silence, heavy, permanent, and impossible to ignore. This story is not about a place known for danger. It is not about a dark alley, a stranger, or a sudden act of rage. It begins in a daycare, a place built on trust, a place where parents leave their children believing they will be safe for just a few hours. One ordinary morning, an emergency call shattered that belief. A baby was not breathing. Then another incident surfaced, and then another truth, one so disturbing that it forced an entire community to confront something unimaginable. This is the story of a child who never reached his first birthday, of warning signs that were missed.
To our family, and his death has left a tremendous hole in our hearts.
And of how the person meant to protect became the greatest threat. What happened next would expose a pattern no one wanted to see, and raise a question that still echoes long after the sirens stopped. How did this happen in a place parents trusted most? The daycare sat quietly in a residential neighborhood, the kind of place parents passed every day without a second thought. There were no warning signs outside, no history of violence, no reason to believe that anything inside those walls could ever go terribly wrong.
I am Chief Brady Jewell of the Savage Police Department. I'm joined by County Attorney Ron Hocevar of the Scott County Attorney's Office, members of the Munkelbus family, police staff, and detectives as well.
For families, it was a routine built on trust. Parents dropped off their children in the morning, kissed them goodbye, and went on with their day believing their babies were safe. The daycare presented itself as licensed, accredited, and reliable. Its public image suggested experience, structure, and care. On paper, it was exactly the kind of place parents look for when choosing who will watch their children. Among those children was a baby boy who had not yet turned one. He was still learning to crawl confidently, still discovering the world through sound, movement, and touch. At home, he was surrounded by love, by parents who documented every small milestone, and a family that adored him deeply.
While nothing can undo what has happened, this arrest brings us closer to answers and accountability. I want to thank Chief Jewell and our entire Savage Police Force for their tireless work on this investigation.
Like many working parents, they relied on daycare not out of convenience, but necessity. Nothing about that morning felt different. Children arrived, staff members took over. The day began the way it always did. Then, just after mid-morning, everything changed. Emergency services received a high-priority medical call from the daycare. A baby was unresponsive, not breathing. The urgency in the call left no room for doubt. This was critical. Police, firefighters, and paramedics rushed to the location. Inside, staff members were panicked. The baby was rushed out and transported to the hospital as life-saving efforts continued. Despite everything that was done, the child did not survive. He was pronounced dead a little over an hour later. He was only days away from his first birthday. At first, no one could explain what had happened. Infants can experience medical emergencies. Tragic as it was, investigators initially approached the case cautiously, aware that not every death is the result of a crime. But this case did not stand alone. As police began gathering information, they learned something deeply unsettling. Just days earlier, another infant at the same daycare, a 4-month-old baby, had experienced a frightening medical episode. That child had been found not breathing, with blood and foam around her mouth and nose. At the time, the incident had been treated as a medical emergency. The baby recovered. There was no immediate indication of foul play, and she was released from the hospital. But then came the detail that shifted everything. On the same morning the older baby died, that 4-month-old had returned to the daycare healthy. A short time later, she was again found unresponsive. Parents rushed her to the hospital. She survived, but only hours later, the second emergency occurred, the one that ended in death. 2 infants, 1 daycare, 1 morning. For investigators, coincidence was no longer an acceptable explanation. The daycare was shut down immediately. Children were sent home. Parents were notified. Behind closed doors, a full investigation began. Police conducted interviews with staff members, reviewed schedules, and reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. Over the next 3 months, detectives interviewed dozens of people. They spoke with parents, co-workers, supervisors, and former employers. They examined past incident reports and emergency calls connected to the daycare. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. In every incident involving a child who stopped breathing, the same employee had been present. She had been the last person to have contact with each of the affected babies. She was 18 years old, and she had been working at the daycare for only 3 weeks. That detail alone raised serious concerns. New employees are typically supervised closely, especially when working with infants who require constant attention and specialized care. Yet here, a young and relatively inexperienced worker had been left alone with some of the most vulnerable children. Investigators also noted her behavior during the emergencies. According to police, her actions and reactions did not align with what they typically observed in accidental medical crises. There were inconsistencies in her statements, shifts in her explanations. At times, she appeared more focused on the chaos than on the children themselves. Initially, she suggested the baby had health issues. She mentioned constipation. She implied that something the parents might have given the child could have played a role. But as investigators pressed further, those explanations began to unravel. Police expanded their investigation beyond the daycare itself. They looked into her background. What they found was troubling. Former employers described attention-seeking behavior. There were records of repeated 911 calls reporting strange or nonsensical incidents, often ending abruptly, reports of erratic actions, accounts of starting fires at a church camp, concerns about her behavior around other children in the past. Individually, some of these incidents might have been dismissed. Together, they painted a disturbing picture. When detectives finally confronted her with what they had uncovered, the case took a dramatic turn. According to police, she confessed. She admitted that she had intentionally restricted the breathing of children in her care, not once, but multiple times. She described doing it not out of anger or hatred, but to create emergencies, to draw attention, to be noticed, and in one instance, she went too far. The baby did not survive. Her confession, police say, was detailed and consistent with the medical evidence and the timeline of events. She was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, along with multiple counts of assault related to the earlier incidents. Bond was set at millions of dollars. For the family, the arrest did not bring relief, only reality. At a news conference, they stood beside investigators, holding onto photographs of the child they had lost. The baby's grandmother spoke on behalf of the family. Her words were not about revenge or anger, but about memory. She spoke of fingerprints still visible on a glass door at home, of crib sheets she could not bring herself to wash, of how a house once filled with laughter now felt unbearably quiet. This case forced a community to confront questions no parent ever wants to ask. How was this allowed to happen? How were warning signs missed? And how many lives were placed at risk before the truth was finally uncovered? The investigation was far from over, and the answers, when they came, would only deepen the tragedy. When investigators stepped back from the individual tragedies and looked at the bigger picture, one thing became clear. This was not an isolated event. It was a sequence. Police reconstructed the timeline carefully, hour by hour, incident by incident. What they found was deeply unsettling. Each emergency followed the same structure. A baby was left alone with the same caregiver. Shortly afterward, that baby was found unresponsive. Panic followed. Emergency services were called. And in 2 of the cases, the child survived, just barely. In the 3rd, the outcome was fatal. That pattern changed the nature of the investigation completely. What had initially been treated as a tragic medical mystery was now being examined as a potential crime. Detectives began working closely with medical examiners, pediatric specialists, and child abuse experts to understand whether the physical evidence aligned with natural causes or with intentional harm. The medical findings raised immediate red flags. In infants, sudden breathing failure can occur, but it rarely presents the same way multiple times in the same environment with the same caregiver present. The symptoms observed, sudden loss of consciousness, lack of breathing, blood, and foam around the nose and mouth, were not consistent with common infant medical conditions. Doctors explained that such signs are often associated with airway obstruction. In simple terms, suffocation.
Breathing again, and was being transported to the hospital by the parents.
That conclusion was not made lightly. Investigators knew the weight of what they were considering. Accusing someone of intentionally harming infants requires overwhelming certainty. Every possibility had to be examined. Every alternative explanation had to be ruled out. They reviewed surveillance coverage and discovered a critical gap. There were no active cameras monitoring the infant rooms. What happened in those moments occurred out of sight, leaving only timelines, medical evidence, and witness statements. Attention turned fully toward the caregiver. During repeated interviews, detectives noted inconsistencies. Her explanations shifted slightly each time. Details were added, removed, or reframed depending on the question. She spoke calmly at times, emotionally at others, but her emotional responses did not always align with the gravity of the events. Most concerning was her focus on the emergencies themselves. According to investigators, she spoke about the chaos, the attention, the reaction of others, far more than she spoke about the children. When asked directly about the babies, her responses were often vague, detached, or deflective. Police also learned that she had been the one to place the emergency calls. She was the first to report the incidents.
I am providing this statement on behalf of Harvey's dad and mom, Hunter and Catherine, his brother, and our entire family.
The first to alert supervisors, the center of attention each time a crisis unfolded. That detail mattered. Criminal psychologists often look not just at actions, but at motivation.
First, we'd like to express our gratitude to the Savage Police Department, and specifically Detective Andrew Dames and his investigative team for their tireless efforts to seek the truth in Harvey's death.
In this case, investigators began to suspect a dangerous psychological driver, attention-seeking behavior through manufactured emergencies. As detectives dug deeper into her past, the picture became clearer and darker. Former employers described a history of dramatic incidents, sudden crises that required intervention, repeated emergency calls that led nowhere, behavior that escalated when attention faded. There were accounts of setting small fires, of provoking reactions, of placing herself at the center of concern, confusion, or fear. None of these past incidents involved infants, but they demonstrated a consistent pattern, creating danger to receive attention. For investigators, this pattern explained what logic could not: why someone would harm children they barely knew, why the incidents escalated, why the emergencies occurred so close together. The motive was not hatred, it was recognition. When detectives confronted her with the pattern, the medical evidence, and her past behavior, the tone of the interviews shifted. The questions became more direct. The pauses grew longer. Eventually, according to police, she stopped denying. What followed was a confession that stunned even seasoned investigators. She admitted to intentionally restricting the breathing of infants in her care. She described how she would do it quietly, briefly, just long enough to cause distress. She said she never intended for a child to die, but acknowledged she knew the risk. She explained it as a need to be noticed. She wanted the response, the urgency, the attention from co-workers, supervisors, and emergency responders. In her words, the emergencies made her feel important. In one instance, she went too far. The baby did not recover. That admission reframed everything. This was no longer a question of negligence or poor supervision. It was an intentional act, repeated multiple times, with escalating risk. Police arrested her and filed multiple charges, including murder and assault. Bond was set at an amount that reflected both the severity of the crime and the danger investigators believed she posed. The daycare's license was suspended immediately. Parents were left grappling not only with grief, but with fear. Many asked the same question over and over: how did this happen here? Investigators acknowledged hard truths. Background checks can miss warning signs. Past behavior does not always appear on official records, and people who crave attention often learn how to hide their most dangerous impulses until they can no longer control them. For the family of the child who died, none of that explanation eased the pain. They returned to a home filled with reminders, toys left untouched, clothes folded and never worn again, a crib that would never again be used for sleep. In public, they spoke about justice. In private, they mourned a future that would never exist. This case shattered the illusion that safety can be guaranteed by reputation alone. It exposed the vulnerability of infants who cannot speak, cannot resist, and cannot protect themselves. And it forced a devastating realization into the open. Sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from the people we trust without question. The arrest did not bring calm, it brought a new kind of shock. For weeks, the community had lived in uncertainty, questions without answers, rumors without proof. But when investigators announced that the deaths and near deaths were intentional, disbelief spread faster than grief ever had. This was not an accident. This was not negligence. This was not a failure of training alone. It was a deliberate act. According to police, the caregiver admitted to suffocating infants in her care on multiple occasions. The admission was not vague or coerced. Investigators described it as detailed, specific in method, sequence, and intent. She explained how she restricted the baby's breathing just long enough to trigger distress, and how she expected intervention to arrive before anything irreversible happened. She said she never meant to kill. But investigators made one thing clear: intent to kill is not required when someone knowingly creates a lethal risk. When a person understands the danger and proceeds anyway, responsibility is absolute. Medical experts supported that conclusion. Infants are uniquely vulnerable. Their airways are small. Their oxygen reserves are limited. Even brief obstruction can cause catastrophic injury or death. What shocked many was not just what she did, but why she said she did it. Investigators stated that her motive was attention, not anger, not hatred, not financial gain. Attention. She described feeling invisible, overlooked, unimportant. The emergencies changed that. Suddenly, everyone was watching her. Supervisors rushed in. Emergency responders arrived. Parents panicked. The room filled with urgency, and she became central to it all. For criminal psychologists, this pattern was tragically familiar. Manufactured crises, especially involving vulnerable victims, are a known but rare phenomenon. The individual creates danger, then positions themselves as the witness, the reporter, sometimes even the rescuer. The emotional payoff comes from the reaction, not the harm itself, but the harm is real, and in this case, it was fatal. As news of the confession spread, attention turned to accountability beyond the accused. Parents demanded answers. How could an 18-year-old with only weeks of experience be left alone with infants? Why were there no active cameras in the infant rooms? How were prior incidents handled so quietly? Regulators launched their own review. The daycare's license was suspended pending appeal. Officials emphasized that licensing does not guarantee immunity from misconduct, only baseline compliance.
Several counts of first-degree assault on the other child. And again, as we indicated earlier, this is still an ongoing investigation. There's still things that need to be tied up and looked at. Obviously, this went on for months. It's extensive. We're still getting paperwork to my office, have it gone through by the prosecutors.
Human behavior, especially when hidden, can bypass even the most carefully designed systems. Still, families wanted more than explanations. They wanted change. The charges reflected the severity of what investigators believed had occurred: murder, multiple counts of assault, bail set so high it effectively ensured detention. Prosecutors signaled early that this would not be a case resolved quietly. But even as the legal process moved forward, a deeper question lingered, one the courtroom could not fully address. How does someone so young commit acts so severe? Mental health experts cautioned against simple answers. Diagnosis requires evaluation, not speculation. While attention-seeking behavior can be associated with certain psychological conditions, it does not excuse criminal conduct. Most people with mental illness are not violent, and violence for attention represents an extreme and dangerous expression of pathology. Importantly, experts also noted that awareness matters. According to investigators, the caregiver understood that what she was doing was wrong. She hid it. She deflected blame. She offered alternate explanations. These actions suggested consciousness of guilt, an understanding of consequences. That understanding matters in court. An insanity defense requires proof that a person could not distinguish right from wrong at the time of the act. Here, the behavior indicated the opposite. She knew it was wrong and proceeded anyway. For the families, clinical explanations offered little comfort. They were left with memories they could not escape. One grandmother spoke publicly about refusing to wash crib sheets marked by her grandson's presence, not because of stains, but because they were proof he had been there. Proof that he existed, proof that love once filled that space. Those details pierced the public consciousness. This was no longer an abstract case. It was a child, a family, a future erased. Community members organized vigils. Parents hugged their children tighter. Many reconsidered childcare arrangements entirely, even as they acknowledged that trust is unavoidable in modern life. Lawmakers, too, took notice. Discussions began around mandatory supervision periods for new childcare employees, around camera requirements in infant rooms, around improved information sharing between employers when safety concerns arise. None of these measures could undo what had happened, but they represented an attempt to ensure that this story would not repeat itself elsewhere. As the case moved toward its first court appearance, prosecutors prepared for a long process. Defense attorneys requested evaluations, motions were filed. The wheels of justice turned slowly, deliberately, and throughout it all, one truth remained unchanged. A child lost his life in a place meant to protect him. No verdict could restore that loss, no sentence could equal it. But the pursuit of accountability mattered, not just for one family, but for every parent who leaves their child in someone else's care, trusting that safety is not just promised, but enforced. This case would test not only the legal system, but society's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about oversight, vulnerability, and the cost of ignoring warning signs. And as the courtroom doors prepared to open, the question was no longer what happened. It was how to make sure it never happens again. When the case finally entered the courtroom, there was no sense of victory, only gravity. By then, the facts were no longer in dispute. Investigators had outlined the pattern, medical experts had explained the cause, and the confession had already stripped away any remaining doubt about what had happened inside that daycare. What remained was accountability. Prosecutors described the case as one of deliberate, repeated endangerment of the most vulnerable victims imaginable: infants who could not cry for help, children who depended entirely on adults for survival. According to the state, this was not a single lapse in judgment. It was a series of conscious decisions that escalated until one child did not survive. The defense focused heavily on the age and mental state of the accused. At just 18 years old, they argued, she lacked maturity and emotional stability. They suggested psychological disturbance, unmet needs, and attention-seeking rooted in deeper trauma. But the prosecution pushed back firmly. Mental health struggles, they argued, do not erase responsibility, especially when actions are hidden, repeated, and followed by deception. They emphasized that she knew what she was doing was wrong. She attempted to shift blame. She offered alternative explanations. She concealed her actions. Those behaviors demonstrated awareness. And awareness matters. Experts explained to the court that while attention-seeking behavior can be associated with certain psychological conditions, it does not equate to insanity. The legal standard is not whether someone is unwell, but whether they understood the nature and wrongfulness of their actions. In this case, investigators were clear. She did. As proceedings continued, attention turned beyond the individual and toward the system that allowed this to happen. How did someone with no long-term experience gain unsupervised access to infants? Why were there no active cameras in the infant rooms? Why were earlier medical incidents not escalated immediately? Regulatory agencies acknowledged gaps. Licensing standards had been met, but licensing does not account for every human risk. Background checks rely on documented offenses, not undocumented patterns of concerning behavior. Supervision policies varied. Staffing shortages sometimes led to compromises. None of those explanations satisfied the families. For parents, this was not about policy, it was about trust. Trust placed in a facility that promised safety. Trust placed in a system meant to protect children. Trust placed in adults who failed to recognize danger in time. The daycare's license remained suspended as appeals and investigations continued. Civil cases loomed. Families began asking not only how this happened, but how to prevent it from happening again. Legislators took notice. Discussions began around mandatory monitoring in infant rooms, around longer probationary supervision for new childcare employees, around better information sharing between employers when safety concerns arise. These conversations were necessary, but they came too late for one family. At a public statement, the child's grandmother spoke with quiet strength. She did not speak about anger. She spoke about memory, about a laugh that once filled the room, about fingerprints still visible on a glass door, about crib sheets she could not bring herself to wash, not because of stains, but because they were proof. Proof that he had been there, proof that he was loved, proof that his life mattered. Her words reminded everyone of the human cost behind the charges and headlines. This was not an abstract case study. This was a child whose future had been erased. First steps never taken, words never spoken, birthdays never reached. For the community, the case left a permanent scar. Parents became more vigilant. Drop-offs lingered longer. Questions were asked that had never been asked before. Familiar routines no longer felt automatic. The illusion of safety had been broken. Experts later reflected that cases like this force society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Systems are designed around trust, but trust without oversight can become dangerous. Most caregivers are dedicated, compassionate, and responsible. But when warning signs appear, no matter how subtle, they must be taken seriously because infants cannot protect themselves. They rely entirely on adults to notice when something is wrong. In the end, the court process moved forward as the law required. Charges were upheld. The accused remained in custody. Future proceedings would determine sentencing and long-term consequences, but no outcome could restore what was lost. Justice in this case could only mean recognition of harm, not repair. The story ends where it began, with a child whose life was measured not in years, but in love, a love that did not end with his death, a name that his family vowed to keep speaking, a memory they refused to let fade. This case is a reminder, one written in irreversible loss, that safety is not just promised by institutions, it is protected by vigilance, accountability, and the courage to act when something feels wrong, because sometimes the warning signs are there, and the cost of ignoring them is far too high. Stories like this don't end when the video ends. They live on in the questions we ask, the lessons we learn, and the awareness we carry forward. If you believe these stories deserve more than silence, stay with us. Subscribe for more real cases, deeper investigations, and stories that matter.